By the end of that lecture, the professor had gone silent. The students were on their feet. And a girl in a hijab had just changed something in that university forever. But to understand how, we need to go back to where it started. By the end of that lecture, the professor had gone silent. The students were on their feet. And a girl in a hijab had just changed something in that university forever. But to understand how, we need to go back to where it started. Back to a Tuesday morning in September. Back to a lecture hall that held 300 people and one girl sitting in the front row who had no idea that the next 40 minutes would define the rest of her life. Her name was Layla. And she had worked for this moment since she was 11 years old. Layla was the daughter of a man who fixed cars for a living and a woman who cleaned office buildings at night so her daughter could study during the day. They had come to America with 2 suitcases and a belief, simple, unshakable, that education was the door through which everything else became possible. Layla had walked through every door she could find. Top of her high school class. National Merit Scholarship finalist. Accepted to one of the most competitive universities in the country with a full academic scholarship. She was the first in her family. The first in her extended family. The first in her entire neighborhood back home to reach this particular door. And on a Tuesday morning in September, she walked through it, her Bordeaux hijab neatly pinned, her notebooks already tabbed and color-coded, her heart beating with the particular mixture of terror and joy that belongs only to the first day of something enormous. Professor Alan Whitmore had been teaching at this university for 31 years. He had published 14 books. His name was on 3 buildings. Students called him brilliant. Colleagues called him difficult. The university called him tenured, which, in academic language, means that very little could touch him. He walked into the lecture hall at exactly 9 o'clock, as he always did, set his notes on the podium without looking at the room, and began. His subject was the history of Western civilization. His voice was the kind that fills a room without effort, low, precise, carrying the absolute confidence of a man who has never been seriously questioned in his own classroom. Layla sat in the front row, pen ready, notebook open. She had read the first 3 chapters of his book the night before. She was prepared. She was excited. She did not yet know what was about to happen. 15 minutes into the lecture, Professor Whitmore paused mid-sentence. He looked out at the room. Then his eyes stopped. On the front row. On Layla. He tilted his head slightly, the way someone does when they've noticed something they find unexpected. Then he said, in the same measured tone he used for everything, "Miss, I'm sorry, I don't know your name yet," the young woman in the front row. With the headscarf. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Around Layla, 300 students went very quiet. Layla looked up from her notebook. "Layla," she said clearly. "My name is Layla." He nodded slowly. "Layla. Tell me, is that a religious garment you're wearing?" The question was academic in its tone. But nothing about that moment was academic. In the 2 seconds before she answered, Layla's mind moved very quickly. She thought of her mother, who had cleaned office buildings at midnight so this day could happen. She thought of the scholarship letter she had read so many times the paper had softened at the folds. She thought of every teacher who had told her she was exceptional, and the few who had made her feel like she had to earn the right to be in the room. She had been in that second category before. She recognized it immediately. She also recognized something else, 300 pairs of eyes, all waiting to see what she would do. She set her pen down. She folded her hands on her notebook. And she looked at Professor Whitmore with the calm of someone who has already decided, long before this moment, exactly who she is. "Yes," she said. "It is." What happened next was the thing that nobody in that room forgot. Professor Whitmore looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back to his notes. And then, almost as an aside, as if he were noting a minor historical footnote, he said, "Interesting." Because this course covers the history of civilization's progress toward reason and individual freedom. I sometimes wonder whether certain cultural symbols represent progress or its opposite. He did not look at her when he said it. He did not name her. He did not have to. 300 students knew exactly who he was talking about. Layla heard a sharp intake of breath from the seat beside her, her new friend Sarah, who she had met exactly 40 minutes ago outside the building and who was already, in this moment, gripping the edge of her desk. Layla did not grip anything. She simply picked up her pen. And she began to write, "Stay with this moment." Because what Layla was writing in that notebook was not a complaint. It was not a response driven by hurt or anger, though she had every right to both. What she was writing was an argument. A precise, structured, historically grounded argument, built from the 3 chapters of his own book that she had read the night before. She had come to this class prepared to learn. She left it prepared to teach. And in about 12 minutes, Professor Alan Whitmore, 31 years, 14 books, 3 buildings, was going to sit down. The lecture continued. But the atmosphere had changed. Students who had been half asleep were now fully awake. 2 students in the back row exchanged a look. A young man in the middle section quietly took out his phone, not to scroll, but to record. Sarah, beside Layla, leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "Are you okay?" Layla didn't look up from her notebook. "I'm great," she said quietly. "I'm taking notes." Professor Whitmore moved through his material, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, the development of secular governance. His argument, implicit in every sentence, was a familiar one, that reason had replaced religion, that progress meant moving away from the sacred toward the rational, that modernity and faith were, at their core, incompatible. He was building a case. What he didn't know was that so was she. With 8 minutes left in the lecture, Layla raised her hand. Professor Whitmore saw it. He paused. Something in his expression shifted, slight, almost imperceptible, but there. He had not expected her hand to go up. "Yes," he said. "Layla." She stood. In a lecture hall where students almost never stood to speak, she stood. Not dramatically, she simply rose to her feet the way you do when you want to make sure your voice reaches the back of the room. "Professor Whitmore," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I'd like to engage with the framework you've been building this morning, if that's all right. Because I think there's a significant historical omission that affects the argument." 300 students did not move. Professor Whitmore looked at her over the rim of his glasses. "By all means," he said. And Layla began. She started with mathematics. Not as a subject, as a historical fact. She reminded the room that the numerical system that made the scientific revolution possible had been developed and transmitted to Europe through Islamic scholars in the 9th and 10th centuries. She cited Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gave the world the word algorithm. She mentioned Ibn al-Haytham, whose work on optics preceded and informed the European Enlightenment by 400 years. She spoke without notes, the information was already in her. She had not looked any of this up last night. She had known it since she was 12, because her father, the man who fixed cars for a living, had read history to her every night before bed and told her, "Layla, know where things come from. Because someday someone will tell you that you come from nothing. And you need to be able to answer them." She moved to medicine. She spoke about Ibn Sina, Avicenna, whose canon of medicine was the primary medical textbook in European universities for 600 years. She talked about the preservation of Greek philosophical texts by Muslim scholars during a period when Europe had largely lost access to them. She was not lecturing. She was not performing. She was simply presenting facts, the kind of facts that were verifiable, documented, and, crucially, drawn in significant part from the footnotes of Professor Whitmore's own published work. At one point she cited a specific page number. Page 247 of his second book. The professor's expression, which had begun with mild tolerance and moved through surprise, was now something harder to read. The room was absolutely silent. Then she arrived at the part that nobody expected. She looked at Professor Whitmore directly and said, "Professor, I'm not here to argue that religion and reason are the same thing. I'm here to suggest that the history you've presented this morning frames progress as a journey away from faith, when the actual historical record suggests something more complex, that faith and reason have, at many crucial moments, not opposed each other but carried each other forward." She paused. "And I'd also like to note, respectfully, that the garment I'm wearing this morning is not a symbol of civilization moving backward. It is a symbol of a woman who chose, freely, in a free country, to be exactly who she is." She sat down. The room was silent for 3 full seconds. Then Sarah started clapping. Then the young man in the middle section. Then, one by one, the room filled with sound. Professor Whitmore stood at his podium. He looked at his notes. He looked at the room, 300 students, most of them now on their feet. He looked at Layla, who was sitting calmly with her hands folded on her notebook, her Bordeaux hijab catching the light from the tall windows, her expression carrying no triumph, no anger, just the quiet certainty of someone who said what needed to be said and meant every word of it. He opened his mouth. Closed it. For the first time in 31 years, in his own classroom, Professor Alan Whitmore had nothing to say. He looked down at his notes one more time. Then he said, quietly, almost to himself, "We'll continue this on Thursday." And he gathered his papers and walked out of the room. The applause followed him all the way to the door. 2 weeks after that Tuesday morning, the university's Faculty of History announced a formal curriculum review. The stated reason was to ensure broader representation of global historical sources in course materials. Nobody said Layla's name in the official announcement. They didn't need to. Everyone knew. Layla heard about it from Sarah, who sent her a message at 7 in the morning with nothing in it but 3 words and a string of emojis. She read it sitting at the kitchen table while her mother made tea before leaving for her night shift. She showed her mother the message. Her mother read it. Set the phone down. Looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she went back to making tea, because the water was ready, and because in their family, the deepest pride had always been expressed not in words but in the simple continuation of the ordinary, beautiful work of living. Layla didn't set out to change anything that Tuesday morning. She set out to learn. But she had been raised by people who understood something that 31 years and 14 books had somehow missed, that the most powerful thing a person can bring into any room is not the approval of those already in it, but the absolute knowledge of who they are and where they come from. She carried that knowledge in a Bordeaux hijab and a color-coded notebook and the memory of her father's voice reading history to her before bed. And on a Tuesday morning in September, in a lecture hall that held 300 people, it turned out to be enough. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And remember, the most important thing you can bring into any room is the unshakable truth of who you are.